So as Dr. Sanjay Pardee said, liver is a very, very important organ in our body. It does multiple functions, and that is why it is called as a powerhouse of our body. And that is why protection of the liver is very, very essential for good health. So we have Dr. Abha Nagral to talk on this subject. Dr. Abha is consultant hepatologist and liver transplant physician, Apollo and Gestok Hospitals, Mumbai. Special interest in pediatric liver disorders, managing trustee of Children's Liver Foundation, an NGO creating awareness about liver disorders in children. Chairperson of the Liver Committee of the ZTCC, that is Zonal Transplant Coordination Committee. She has more than 90 PubMed publications in national and international journals. So I welcome Dr. Abha Nagral to start her talk.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks to the Kandivali Medical Association, to Dr. Neeta, my classmate from MBBS days, Dr. Sanjay, Dr. Vinod. We are indeed going through difficult times, unprecedented times. And what we have seen is that, of course, people are suffering from COVID and the problems related to COVID. But there are other patients, like our other liver patients, who are not seeking help, not getting their tests done, not doing their sonographies on time. And it is this other population which is actually, I feel, in a way more affected, the non-COVID patients in COVID times. And of course, all the lay people, the general population, there is so much fear about everything that, they are living on hot vapors and kadas and whatnot. And I thought Neeta suggested this topic, and I thought it's a good opportunity for us to talk about general protection of the liver and also a little bit on the COVID and what liver has to do with COVID. So I think without much ado, I'll start my talk. So just a little bit on functions of the liver. We know that the liver is a vital organ. In fact, it is referred to as jigar. And if you remember many old Hindi movies, the people would talk about jigar as the most important vital organ. And it is indeed a vital organ. It produces proteins, many proteins. We are familiar with albumin, clotting factors. It also produces bile, which is important for fat and fat-soluble vitamin absorption. It stores carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And it's the first stop for all the junk that we eat. So whatever gets absorbed from the intestine through the portal circulation reaches the liver, and it gets detoxified there and then goes to the heart and gets circulated in the body. So it really is the first detoxifier organ in the body, and it regulates a fair amount of hormone function also. Now, if we were to talk of important liver diseases, I think in today's day and age, the whole focus is now on fatty liver. And I'll just talk a little bit in more detail about fatty liver. Viruses were always there. Alcohol has been there since times immemorial. And then there's a whole lot of drugs which can affect the liver knowingly and unknowingly. There are autoimmune liver problems and genetic problems which can also affect the liver. But the ones in blue are the ones which I'll really cover today because those are the common ones. So talking of fatty liver disease, here on the left panel, you can see a normal liver, and on the right is a liver which is full of fat. It appears yellow, and this is how the corresponding microscopy looks. You can see these empty fat globules in the liver. So you can have a patient who has fatty liver disease, which could be a normal liver, could be just fat in the liver, and if it gets converted into inflammation and fibrosis, it is called NASH, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Now, fatty liver disease has become the #1 cause of chronic liver disease in the world, and I would say in India as well. I mean, we are seeing more and more fatty liver disease related chronic liver disease, and also has become the #1 indication for liver transplants in the world. And I think we are also soon getting there. So what is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? It's not really a liver disease. In fact, it's just a tip of the iceberg for what we call the metabolic syndrome or the insulin resistance. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it in various lectures. The physicians, the cardiologists, everybody probably talks about this. And it is related and associated with obesity, dyslipidemia, diabetes, hypertension, etc. So there has been a new term which is being coined, that it should, so you can't have a patient who's being looked at the hepatologist, diabetologist, endocrinologist, physician, a cardiologist. It just doesn't make sense. So the term which is now being used is a metabolic dysfunction related liver disease. Okay, and this should ideally be managed by what we call metabolic physicians, people who can look after all the aspects of this disease rather than patient going from one place to the other. And I think the family physicians here would play a very major role. And if people are still interested in kind of so-called specializing in family practice, this is one area I would say that one could focus on, where you could look at all these issues because you are seeing them more and more, and it will be more of a holistic management for the patient than the patient having to go from one consultant to the other, and each one not knowing or not really caring about what the other one has advised. And we are seeing this a lot, and I don't think it's a nice situation. So, this is a study from All India Institute, where they looked at all patients who had abnormal transaminases, abnormal SGOT-PT, and they found that 1/3 of them was due to a fatty liver disease. And this is, if you have a patient who's getting liver function tests for whatever reason, and you find incidentally high liver enzymes, one should think of a fatty liver disease. What about its prevalence? If you can see through various parts of India, it is around 20%. So 20% of the entire population is a huge number. And this is coming to around 244 million. Most studies show that males are more predisposed compared to females. And we know the pattern of central obesity, which we have in males in our country. Now, the point is it only seen in obese people? And the answer is no. And this is even more worrying. So you may have a person with a normal BMI and yet have a fatty liver. And these are not patients who are taking alcohol, and other causes of fatty liver have been ruled out. So this study, a nice study from Kolkata, showed that they looked at a rural population, and they found that 75% had a BMI less than 25, and they labeled this lean NASH, patients who were not obese and still had NASH. So if you were to look at what happens what is the natural history of this disease, so initially there's steatosis, or just fat in the liver, followed by inflammation, so steatohepatitis, and fibrosis. And this, over a period of 7 to 8 years, in about a quarter of patients will develop into cirrhosis. And in another quarter of patients, in the further 8 to 10 years, will present with various complications of cirrhosis like ascites, variceal bleed, encephalopathy, etc. Now, this is an important point, and that's why I highlighted the importance of a metabolic physician, that the cause of death in a patient with liver cirrhosis due to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is not because of the liver. Most often, it's a cardiovascular cause of death, number one. Number two is malignancies. We know that people who have obesity are prone to many malignancies. I'm not talking about malignancies of the liver alone, malignancies elsewhere. And number 1 and 2 cause of death are cardiovascular and malignancy, and then liver only is seen in 1 to 2%. So even if you have NASH cirrhosis, it's likely that the person will have a mortality due to a cardiovascular or a malignancy cause rather than the liver disease by itself. What is the prevalence of obesity in India? And this was quite shocking, that one would expect that, people, many are below the poverty line, many are unaffording, but only 15% of the population is underweight or normal weight. and the rest of it is actually overweight. So look at this, the overweight or obese. So obesity is not equal to affluence, what we thought. Obesity is seen in the lower socioeconomic strata as well. And the more junk food we eat, the more obesity there is. And this is seen in Western countries. It's the poor who go to the KFCs and McDonald's and eat the junk food, and they are the ones who are actually suffering in a way more. So obesity is not equal to affluence, not equal to socioeconomic strata at all. So I talked about this. The need of the management is a multidisciplinary approach. The various consults which may be needed. Bariatric surgeon would come later, much later in the disease. And basically, there should be some metabolic physician who's managing everything. And there is some dialogue between various people who are involved in the management. It cannot be isolated management by each alone. So it is all finally lifestyle. Of course, fatty liver has a genetic predisposition. We know that fatty livers and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease runs in families. You hear of many patients who have come with a fatty liver to you and who says that their parents had liver cirrhosis or their grandparents had liver cirrhosis. Earlier, we used to look for some rare genetic causes, and now we know that all these familial cirrhosis which we saw were most likely related to fatty liver disease. So we have switched to the Western diet. There's lack of exercise. There's a huge addiction to social media, which in a way ensures that our children don't go out to play and that we are stuck to the seats and involved with various what should I say, means of communication on social media. So very little motivation for exercise, sports. And I must say, in a way, the COVID pandemic has made this whole thing worse because it has confined people to their homes and made given a good reason to not really exercise and step out. So how can one prevent progression of fatty liver disease? First and most important is weight reduction, and this is through diet and exercise. Now, there are a whole lot of things in the market like colon cleansing, herbal supplements. There's a herbal supplement called Herbal Life, which was found to actually be hepatotoxic and should not be encouraged to be used. And various drugs have been used for treatment of NASH. But I must put in here that various drugs are being promoted right now. I'll not really talk of drugs. The thing which is really seen to have made a difference is weight reduction, diet, and exercise. So what weight reduction? Now, weight reduction should be 5 to 10% of your body weight and aim to lose half to 1 kilo per week. Do not do any crash dieting, and that in fact in a way would worsen the fatty liver. So about 25 to 30 kilocalories per day, per kg per day of ideal body weight, and I'll come to ideal body weight in a minute, and about 40% from carbohydrates, a fair amount of protein, and less than 30% fat. Less than 10% should come from saturated fat. So this is how you calculate the ideal body weight. You have this calculator online. You can just Google ideal weight calculator, put in your age, gender, and height, and calculate. And it'll give you the ideal body weight based on various formulae. You could even, if you wish, take the one which is the highest. So for a person who's 57, female, height of 160, ideal body weight should be 57 kilos. So that's an approximate way of finding out what your ideal weight should be, and then you can work towards it. What about diet? You have to reduce carbohydrates. We always focused on fats, and fatty liver is equal to fat, but that is actually not true. What you really need to focus on is carbohydrates, and we know that Indian diet is very high on carbohydrates. So cut down carbohydrates. People drink fruit juices as a healthy thing, but that's not a good idea. The ready-made fruit juices is definitely not a good idea because all kinds of preservatives, and you're removing the fiber from the fruit. So the good part of the fruit is actually gone. So if one should take a lot of fruits and vegetables, but it should be fruits, eating fruits rather than drinking fruit juices. Of course, all kinds of processed food in general should be avoided. So anything which is ready-made in a bottle or a packet from outside, avoid. Always a good idea to give an individualized diet based on the patient's needs and habits, rather than giving a fixed diet of something fancy which the patient has never even heard of before. Adherence to the diet is a challenge, and therefore certain weight programs which I know of have incorporated a psychologist in their program, because the psychologist will analyze the patient's eating habits and binge eating and what drives the person to binge eating and control that. So inclusion of a psychologist is very important. Small frequent meals, whether it should be intermittent fasting or whether you follow the Dikshit diet, you're all familiar with Dikshit diet where there's fasting, or Devekar diet who says that eat everything which is homemade, So I would say that no fixed diet really, any diet with a name probably should be avoided because they go to extremes. But talking of a diet with a name, probably the best diet is in fatty liver disease is the what we call the Mediterranean diet. And this is a diet which focuses on fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, fish, and nuts. This is the key thing in the diet. Now, if you can see here in the picture, if you have to eat cheese, cheese is good, but take cottage cheese. Don't take the other processed cheeses. Cottage cheese can be made at home, what we call paneer. So avoid crash diets completely. And because these cannot be sustained and the weight comes back in no time. Black coffee has been shown to be protective, and it's a good idea to have black coffee. Now, this is something I think where we all falter. There's no time for lunch, so quickly grab a snack and eat it. So we know that these are common popular snacks in our country. And these snacks actually can give you much more calories than a formal meal. And when you eat a samosa or a vada pav, you're not eating one, you are going to eat two. So that's where the problem arises. So this snacking should be avoided, and don't replace it for meals. And here you can see that, you have one slice of pizza, which is 230 calories, whereas when you walk briskly for 30 minutes, you're burning only 97 calories. So to overcome this 230 calories, you'll have to walk much more. Similarly, one big samosa, Punjabi samosa as we call it, 350 calories. But when you're swimming for 30 minutes, which is a vigorous exercise, you're only spending 260 calories. So your one samosa cannot be countered by swimming for 30 minutes. Same for the cake, slice of cake. So what I'm trying to tell you is that really we should start counting our calories. Now we have various apps which are available on the phones which can be put to, actually give you an idea, because you think, oh, okay, I'm having just a samosa for lunch, but it's not so simple. What about exercise? Now, it should be some form of cardio. Now, point is, you'll say, even if I'm lean, thin, do I need to do exercise? Yes, because exercise may not really help so much in weight loss, but it definitely improves cardiovascular fitness and all the other diseases associated with the metabolic syndrome. So you can, even if you are a sedentary worker, not sit at one place for a time. Everybody is doing online work nowadays. Get up every half an hour, go around, go up and down the stairs in your building. There's no actual excuse to not exercise or not increase physical activity. Moderate intensity exercise 3 times a week for 45 minutes. If you're doing something high intensity, it could be reduced. The time could be reduced to 30 minutes. And the whole idea of exercise is to achieve a target heart rate. If you are just ambling nicely, listening to some music in the garden, it's really not going to help unless the target heart rate is achieved. And what is target heart rate? This is the maximum heart rate into 0.7 if you're doing moderate intensity exercise, and into 0.85 if you're doing a high intensity exercise. How to calculate the maximum heart rate is 220 minus age. So if you are 50 years old, your target heart rate would be 220 minus 50, which is 170. So you have to exercise till you at least reach a heart rate of 170 into 0.7 if you're doing a moderate intensity exercise. So that's how one can calculate their heart rate, and you really don't need to go to gyms to do all this. It can be all done at home. So really, By what do you do? By resistance exercises. By resistance exercises, what I spoke about over here are all cardios. Resistance exercises when you kind of use various equipments like bands, therabands, etc., where against resistance you are pulling a muscle. So it helps in increasing muscle mass and reducing the visceral fat mass. So that is what you achieve. So a cardio with resistance exercises is actually what is needed for weight loss in a patient with fatty liver. Now, even in a lockdown, as I said, people work confined to home. If you just Google workouts at home, you will find so many things which can be done at home. So really with you to not exercise even during these times. Now, I must show you how weight loss has helped in improving fatty liver disease. So if you lose 3% of your weight, the fat goes down considerably. If you lose 5% of the weight, the inflammation in the liver goes down. And if you lose 7 to 10% of your weight, then the fibrosis actually regresses. So we are actually saying, what is cirrhosis? Cirrhosis is nothing but what we call F4 fibrosis. So when we when we do a fibroscan or other non-invasive markers of fibrosis, we are looking at grades of fibrosis in the liver. So you have F0, which is no fibrosis, to F4, which is cirrhosis. And it has been shown that weight loss can actually reverse cirrhosis because you come down from F4 to F3 to F2. So F2 or more is significant fibrosis. And if you have that, then you are more prone to developing cirrhosis. These are the patients who will need aggressive weight loss. So that was something about fatty liver. Now switching gears, talking about viral hepatitis. Now, just to recapitulate, I'm sure you've heard this before. You have 5 types of what we call hepatotropic viruses, which mainly affect and multiply in the liver. Hepatitis A can be seen in mainly children, but it is usually subclinical. So a child may have hepatitis A, but not really show any signs of jaundice. We know he's had hepatitis A only when you do antibodies and you find the child has been protected with the hepatitis A IgG antibody. Hepatitis B is spread through various routes, parenteral, but also horizontal, that is from one family member to another, vertical from a pregnant mother to a child, sexual, and this has a propensity to become chronic. C also is similar to hepatitis B, but there we don't see so much of horizontal, vertical, and sexual. It's mainly parenteral through blood transfusion or IV drug abuse. D is an incomplete virus which occurs only with B. And what we see the most common is hepatitis E. It's in adults, also seen in children, but it is the commonest cause of sporadic and epidemic hepatitis which is in the country. Now, A and E are usually acute. E can become chronic rarely in those who are immunocompromised. So that's just one thing to remember. But for all practical purposes, if you recover from A and E, you've recovered from these viruses and you're probably protected. For E, we are not sure, but A, yes. Just to show you the prevalence, hepatitis A, we are in the high endemic zone for hepatitis A. For hepatitis E, again, the same thing. You can see India is in the high prevalence zone. For hepatitis B, we are in the intermediate zone. So we have a prevalence of about 4% in the country. And hepatitis C also, we somewhere in the intermediate prevalence zone, around 1% of the population. So how these viruses are transmitted and therefore how can we actually prevent viral hepatitis? Now, talking of the common ones, hepatitis A and E, these are mainly through food and water, as I said, fecal-oral transmission. So not uncommon to see this. Now we know often when one is having sugarcane juice at the roadside, the problem is sugarcane juice is mainly available only at the roadside. And it's a cheap drink. It's a drink full of calories. It can quench your thirst and your hunger. So it's very tempting to have. And of course, it's very, very tasty. But the way it is made with flies sitting around, not a good idea to have sugarcane juice. Pani puri, great. Person is using hands, don't know how he's washed him. He's using water. Obviously, he's not using mineral water or boiled water. So avoid these kind of things where you have a propensity for water or fecal transmission. Even if you go to a nice restaurant and served a fancy mocktail, it will have ice and water in it. Don't know how this ice and water has actually been prepared. So, and of course, having a gola at Juhu Beach, I don't know whether you can do that today in today's days, but great idea, very tasty. It reminds us of our childhood days. But all these things, so any ice, water, raw food outside, I think would be completely avoidable. Because we've seen that most hepatitis E epidemics which have occurred by the contamination of sewage water with drinking water. And these parts actually run together. So contamination is not difficult, it can happen. So whenever the sewage water contaminates drinking water, you have these epidemics occurring in entire area, entire population of a city getting affected. And we know many epidemics have occurred in the country. What about hepatitis B? Hepatitis B is basically spread through the parenteral route, as I said. There are certain modes which are not talked about and these actually are the more common modes, more than blood transfusion or sexual transmission. These are the modes which are most common in our country. So, you know, again, using a razor blade, going out for a shave, you don't know whether this blade is new or not, how he's using it. Intramuscular injections, less common nowadays, but we recently, a couple of years ago, had an outbreak in Gujarat where the needle was new, which the doctor was using, but he was using the same vial of a multivitamin injection to inject various people. So the same vial and the needle which was put in the vial was common, and then it was being aspirated and injected, and there was a huge outbreak of hepatitis B in the population. You know, in the family, as you said, horizontal transmission, you have a child who gets infected through some route, has had a blood transfusion, say, he's putting various toys in his mouth, another child is doing the same thing, and so this child transmits the infection to another child, because we know that saliva is full of hepatitis B. So mouthing of toys is seen, and you know, many states in the country do not have universal immunization for hepatitis B. So in Maharashtra, we've been lucky, we've had it for a long time, but there are still places which do not have universal immunization. So we do see children also coming with hepatitis B. Dental jobs is another mode of spread, and really it's important that the dentist uses gloves, changes gloves between patients, and of course all the equipment which is used is sterilized. The water which we drink in between procedures, the glasses are used afresh. So a lot of risk, a potential risk, I would say, at the dentist for developing these hepatitis B and C, you know, parentally transmitted infection. We know that a lot of dental jobs, there is a fair amount of bleeding which takes place, root canal, etc. So be careful. And of course, this is another thing which we don't see uncommonly. The other common ones for hepatitis C, as I said, blood transfusions, IV drugs, not common in Maharashtra, fortunately, but Northeast and Punjab, quite common. You must have seen this movie called Udta Punjab, where they talked about it in fair detail. Mother to baby transmission, again, not so common for C, more common for B, but now we are taking precautions in giving immunoglobulin and vaccine to the child within 12 hours of birth. So that has to be done if the mother is hepatitis B positive. Those who have a high viral load, we are actually giving them antiviral drugs in the third trimester, just to reduce the risk of transmission by reducing the viral load. And these are the fads which we see nowadays. Tattooing is very popular, body piercing and unprotected sex. All these can cause hepatitis B and C. How would you care for your liver if you have acute hepatitis? Of course, there's no specific medication. I must say there's so many liver tonics in the market, both allopathic and Ayurvedic drugs, but none of them have been proved to prevent liver failure, which is what the endpoint should be. Of course, there's a lots of fads regarding diet in hepatitis. And I must say that really, again, Give the diet which the patient tolerates. It should be home cooked food. Water should be boiled and cooled. And that's about it. There's not too much restriction on fats. If the patient fancies eating something fatty, there's no problem. Most patients will not have the desire at all to eat those foods, but if there is, there's no problem. Again, the most important advice, it should be that raw food should be thoroughly washed and preferably eat at home. Now, complementary and alternative medicines, again, not proven useful. People do take Liv52. Everybody takes Liv52 with a liver problem before they come to us. But again, Liv52 and randomized and evidence-based studies has not been proven to be beneficial. And of course, if it is acute hepatitis B or C, then you would want to give specific antiviral drugs. What about diet? As I said, no specific diet. And of course, a lot of people encourage sugarcane juice by itself is not bad. It's a good idea to have sugarcane juice. It's just that the way it is prepared is where the problem lies. So would not really encourage giving sugarcane juice in an attack of acute viral hepatitis, and regular simple homemade food is good enough. You do not need to give boiled food and cut down all fats altogether. And this is a point I want to emphasize. Of course, to protect against hepatitis B, there are certain, we have universal immunization in our state, but in adults who've not got hepatitis B vaccine, the high risk ones. So any patient with any chronic disorder coming to you should be vaccinated. Patients on dialysis are particularly prone to not develop a protective antibody response, and they may double the dose of vaccine. All of us should be vaccinated. I hope all of you are vaccinated with the 3 doses, and it's a good idea to test after vaccination whether you have 1 month after you finish the 3 doses, test whether you have protective antibodies or not. And if not, then it's a good idea to take boosters. And the standard dose is, of course, it has to be given over the deltoid. That's important because it does not get absorbed very well in the buttocks. And it has to be given at 0, 1, and 6 months. Children, of course, we give it over the lateral aspect of the thigh. Now, there are rapid regimes also which can be used in special circumstances when you want to give rapid protection to the patient. So how do I know that I'm protected? Most of us often forget to take the 3rd dose. 3rd dose, if it's missed at 6 months, can be taken up to 12 months also. So whether you have this protective antibody or not, if it's more than 10, there is antibody. And therefore, if it is not, one could take a booster. Now, this is a common problem, especially amongst our profession, where a person gets a needle stick from a patient who's hepatitis B positive. What do? You often get frantic calls middle of the night for this, and ask for the vaccination history. If the person is unvaccinated, you need to immediately give the immunoglobulin, which is what you give to a newborn child. But child gets 100 units, the adult will need 1,000 units. And it has to be given within 12 hours of the needle stick with the vaccination. Now, the only problem with this is this costs at least 40 to 45,000 rupees. So, and it has to be procured, not so easy to procure it immediately. So this is, if you're unvaccinated, often the vaccination is incomplete. You can ask the lab to quickly give you an antibody titer. It has to be given immediately. That's the one important thing. The titers are less, go through the same route. If they are more than 10, then there's no treatment. The person is protected. What about hepatitis A vaccine? Now, most children nowadays do get the hepatitis A vaccine. People coming from abroad would take the hepatitis B vaccine. I would give it to all patients of chronic liver disease if their IgG antibody against hepatitis A is negative. That means they have not had previous exposure and they're not protected. Now, whether to give it at 3 years of age when it is advised or give it later is a debatable question. I personally prefer to check antibodies when the child goes into standard 10 and then give the vaccination, because we do not know whether the vaccination given in early childhood will give protection through the life. So, so standard 10, because you don't want him to miss exams because of the virus. Also, by that age of 16, 17, most we've seen in studies that about anywhere from 50 to 80% are protected without having history of jaundice in the past. That means they've got exposed. And we know that when hepatitis A occurs in childhood, it's a mild attack and therefore will not really cause any problems. Whereas the same hepatitis A, if it occurs in an adult, can be very severe and life-threatening. So you want to protect against hepatitis A as the child is going into adulthood. Now, this must be a familiar picture. It was circulated in many WhatsApp groups and newspapers during the lockdown. And if you've guessed already, these are queues for alcohol when the government had lifted and allowed the shops to open for some time, because there was plea from people who consumed alcohol regularly that they were really suffering from withdrawal and various symptoms. And of course, the government had to make some money, and this was the best way and the quickest way to do so. So alcohol is a big problem. We have a lot of Indian made foreign liquor and entire gamut of liquor which is consumed in the country. Now, little facts about alcohol. What are safe units of drinking? If you drink less than 2 units a day for men and less than 1 unit for women, then it may be safe as far as the disease is concerned. The problem is that people may often not stop at this amount, and it can go further. Women known to develop liver disease much faster because they are deficient in the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme compared to men. So for a man and a woman taking the same amount of alcohol, the woman is more likely to develop chronic liver disease. Now, the important fact is this, that it does not matter whether you are having Scotch whiskey or country liquor. Both are equally harmful because the amount of alcohol and grams of alcohol in both may be similar. Beer and wine are not safe alcohols. Many times people stop drinking whiskey, vodka, gin and switch to beer and wine, but not a good idea, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And this argument, which often is used, that it is good for the heart, does not really hold, because often, as I said, it does not stop at 1 or 2 drinks. So what is 1 unit of alcohol? As I said, 1 unit for a female and 2 units for a male is permissible, because in the West, the Western guidelines, because in the West, alcohol is part of their regular, normal culture. So 1 unit is 8 to 10 grams of pure alcohol, which is found in 250 ml of beer and 100 ml of wine and 30 ml of whiskey. So obviously, when the person is just drinking beer or wine, he's not going to be taking 30 ml. He'll be taking 250 ml or at least 100 ml. So that's the point I was making, that wine and beer are equally bad because finally they are giving the same amount of alcohol. So how can you stay off alcohol? There are behavioral therapy is something which has worked. There are, of course, rehab centers, may work, may not work. There are drugs to reduce the craving. But what I have found useful in my practice is this group called Alcoholic Anonymous, which was set up way back in 1935 by Bill Wilson and Bob Smith. Now, both of them had a problem with alcohol. And the way they function was they just would strike ships with each other in planes, parties, any social gatherings, and talk about alcohol. And if they found that somebody had a problem, they would have a group meeting and just share their experiences. There was no drug, there was no fees. And now they have more than 2 million people worldwide who are kind of part of this group. My first exposure to Alcoholic Anonymous was actually in KEM when I was doing my residency in medicine there, where AA meetings were being held, and I would, with great interest, go and attend those meetings. Now I continue to hold these meetings in my clinic because I have a fair number of patients with this problem. So Mumbai alone has about 200 centers, and there are around more than 1,000 centers all over India. And they also develop a kind of 1-to-1 ratio. So if I'm an alcoholic, I will be given a sponsor who will keep checking on me, on my spouse, and make sure that I'm not consuming alcohol. And if my spouse gives a call to the sponsor that, look, there is a problem, the sponsor will immediately call me up and chat with me and ensure that I do not start binge drinking again. The other liver problem, not very commonly recognized, but quite common, is drugs. And especially people, so I'll talk about some hepatotoxic drugs. We know many antibiotics, many non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs can cause liver issues. And these are also often the cause of raised enzymes, which we see, which are unexplained. So whenever you have a patient with raised enzymes, please ask for history of any non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or antibiotics which have been taken before you start doing a whole battery of tests on them to find out the cause. Now, if you have a patient with a pre-existing liver disease, what are the safe drugs to take? For analgesia, though paracetamol in large doses is known to be hepatotoxic and even cause liver failure, it is still the safest drug to take in patients who have a liver problem. So up to 2 grams, that's the limit. No NSAID, so no Brufen, Biflam, Voveran in patients with liver disease. Though it is said avoid aspirin, but I said fatty liver disease patients often have other cardiac issues and need aspirin, so they should be allowed to take aspirin. Sedatives should be avoided in those with liver disease, and especially the benzodiazepines, which is all the PAMs which you have, alprazolam, oxazepam, lorazepam seem to be slightly better. If one has to give a sleeping drug, then zolpidem in small dose, like 5 milligram, would be a safe drug to give. Of course, for alcohol addiction, to reduce the craving, we do not give disulfiramide. It has a toxic effect on the liver. For those who already have a pre-existing liver disease, baclofen would be a good drug to give for reducing craving. And then there are various anticonvulsants which should not be used. Levetiracetam and lamotrigine are relatively safer in liver patients. If you have a patient with a full-blown cirrhosis, you would avoid using aminoglycosides, and even other drugs need to be modified. Similarly, the doses need to be modified for various antidepressants. So in short, if you have a patient with chronic liver disease, make sure that the drug dosage is right, make sure that the drugs are not contraindicated. So there are certain do's and don'ts which we advise in chronic liver disease. A patient of cirrhosis should get an ultrasound and alpha-fetoprotein done regularly. If any IV contrast, say CT scan or an MR is needed, then ensure that there is good hydration. Now, this is a point I want to emphasize. Proton pump inhibitors are very freely used, very liberally used by us, and this should be clearly avoided. We have now studies to show that long-term proton pump inhibitor use, like pantoprazole and all the prazoles, has been associated with osteoporosis. In liver patients, they increase the risk of various infections and should be avoided. And I also talked about various other drugs. Alcohol, even if the cause of cirrhosis is hepatitis B or C or fatty liver disease, alcohol has to be completely avoided. And important, make sure all the patients are not just vaccinated for hepatitis B, but checked for protective antibodies. And you'll be surprised to see that in this subcategory of patients, many of them would have not mounted a protective response and will need booster doses or higher doses of vaccination. Also, a yearly flu vaccine to the entire family of any patient with a chronic disease is important. I made sure that all the patients were told about getting the flu shot this year, and they wondered whether it would protect them from corona. And I said, no, not yet, but at least it will protect you from flu, the other flus, and swine flu. And it has to be given every year because the strains change. And it's a good idea to give it before the rainy season, which is when you expect the flu to occur. Now, a little bit finally about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the liver. Now, this is the virus particle, and you can see that it has these spikes on it, which are called spike glycoproteins. Now, it is at the help of these spikes that the virus attaches itself to various receptors in the body. And in fact, it is these spikes which are a target for the vaccine, the antibodies, and even the diagnostic tests. So what are the receptors these spikes are binding to? They're binding to these ACE2 receptors, and they bind to these receptors in much more affinity compared to the SARS virus. And the liver and the cholangiocytes, the bile duct cells, have these receptors as well, including the intestine. And this explains why patients of COVID have high enzymes and why they have diarrhea, because it is there in the intestinal cells and the liver cells, these receptors where this virus binds. So if you have a patient who's a known patient of liver disease and develops raised enzymes during this time, it could be a flare of the disease, it could still be a super infection, it could be that the patient is still drinking, but keep in mind, it could be COVID-19 as well. And not just that, in a patient who has COVID-19, he may develop drug-induced liver injury because these two drugs, tocilizumab is now fortunately not being used because not being found of much value, and remdesivir also has been shown to cause liver toxicity. And now there is, just yesterday, there was a report in the Times which said that there's a doubt whether this drug is also doing any good at all. So I think finally, really what is really working in the severe cases, hypoxia cases, is just steroids. So there are certain guidelines of avoiding remdesivir if the SGPT is more than 5 times the upper limit of normal. So if you have a person with raised enzymes in the setting of liver disease, also do think of COVID-19 as a possible cause, just to highlight that fact. What about patients with fatty liver disease? If 20% of your population has fatty liver, then these are the patients, they have been shown that they will have more severe disease. So a patient with a fatty liver and metabolic syndrome, if he develops COVID, he is likely to have more severe COVID disease. And that's another good reason why we should keep our weights under control. So how have we managed liver disease during COVID times? Now we have seen that patients are not following up regularly. They are missing their blood tests, which have been advised. These are patients of cirrhosis, for example, who need regular blood tests, who need regular ultrasounds for surveillance. We know that patient with cirrhosis should get an ultrasound every 6 months to look for cancerous tumors. Now, we have found patients who are landing up after 8 months with a big tumor, which was not picked up because he didn't get his routine surveillance ultrasound done. And they are coming also often with a complication. They are not coming to the hospital when they develop a complication and just out of fear of coming to a hospital. So we have actually in this COVID times encouraged telehepatology, as we would like to call it. There are so many video consult platforms. For myself, I have told patients, especially of cirrhosis, to keep a blood pressure apparatus, a weighing machine, a pulse oximeter at home. And before a consult, to check their weights, their BP, pulse, and the saturation. And so when they come up for consultation, we have their vitals ready at the time of consultation. And these are all the video consultation pictures which I have taken. You can get a fair idea when you do a video consult with them. This is a patient of cirrhosis whose ascites has gone up to the extent that he's developed such dilated veins over the abdominal wall. And here's another patient who's demonstrating whether he has flaps or not. So there's a fair amount. This is a lady with viral hepatitis who sought to put on this medicated thread around her neck to get rid of the jaundice. And this is a child who was deteriorating and who was on our transplant list, in fact, who got transplanted. But I could keep a close watch on the side, even when the child was at home. I did not encourage him coming to the hospital, but he did manage to get transplant during the COVID times and is doing very well. So what is the general advice? We keep emphasizing social distancing, even with our liver patients, like for everybody else, and hand washing. These two things are things which really cannot be substituted by anything else. We have avoided hospital visits. We have encouraged video consults. This manage travel was difficult. It's very easy now for people who don't have their own vehicle, and encouraged working from home. An important thing is to keep medication stocks at home. Now it's a little less difficult, but earlier there was a problem with this and people were running out of medications and not getting medications. They have also said do not attend support group meetings like AA meetings physically, but these people are now doing good virtual meetings and one could always join that. And of course, follow the standard do's and don'ts for cirrhosis. So we've learned some lessons for us, which we can extrapolate to hopefully when this COVID goes away. We learned that we can do a lot on video consults, saves time, money, energy for everybody, not only the patient, but also us. A patient with ascites, we often call him to the clinic. The poor patient travels all the way just to show his creatinine and electrolyte reports, which can be done electronically now. When we look at the videos, patients in their own homes, we get a fair insight into their lives, their relationships with family. Is the patient sitting alone, or does he have the entire family pitching in to tell his complaints? We get a fair idea about their socioeconomic status, and also really, to my surprise, we've realized that even though a patient cannot manage to communicate, on the social media platform, his children are excited. So they all managed to finally do a video consult through various means, either themselves or with the help of their relatives and young children who are very tech savvy nowadays. So people have actually been compelled to use and on the internet, emails and online platforms, which have also been used to make payments online. So there's a lot we've learned, and I think a fair amount of this we can carry forward in our non-COVID times, which should be soon, hopefully. And I'd like to end my talk by saying that if somebody asks me, because this has been asked to me in many talks before, what is the best liver tonic? I would say it is coffee. This has been proven that if you have 4 cups of black coffee, it will really help many liver problems, especially fatty liver disease. But it has to be black, no sugar, no milk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Appa. Now we shall open the forum for question answer session, and there are already few questions in the chat box. So the first question is, are there any false positives for high BMI?
Yeah, good question. There are. And we realized this the hard way when we would get certain foreign nationals, especially people from Africa. They have huge muscle mass. So BMI is only looking at weight and height. It's not looking at the amount of fat. So a person who's got a big muscle mass will come with a high BMI. But if you actually look at his visceral fat, there's not much visceral fat. So a BMI can be high with little visceral fat, and therefore BMI is not a great indicator for determining your risk of fatty liver disease or other problems associated with metabolic syndrome.
Dr. Vinod Birajdar is asking, there's a new study which says that waist-hip ratio is useless in calculating BMI. Is it true? If true, then what is the modality to calculate BMI? DEXA scan is relatively costlier.
Yeah, so no, we don't. Waist-hip ratio is not a calculation of BMI. Waist-hip ratio is to give you the risk of the metabolic syndrome. So if your waist to hip ratio is more, for BMI calculation, you need only height and weight. There's a specific formula and you need only height and weight. But waist-hip ratio gives you an idea of, so if your waist girth is more, you are more likely to have visceral fat. And that translates into the risk of the metabolic syndrome. That's what the waist-hip ratio gives. So that is what, and there are all these things which you have, machines which you have, like DEXA is one machine, which tells you the amount of muscle mass, fat mass, and visceral fat mass. And these are not expensive, is not as expensive. You just need to do them once. And they will give you a fair idea of your visceral fat, and that's what one is looking at. So the idea is to cut down the visceral fat and increase the muscle mass in your body.
Dr. Rajesh is asking whether there are any diagnostic criteria for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
There are no specific criteria. You need to show that there is fat in the liver with various imaging techniques. Ultrasound is the simplest, but ultrasound will pick up only 30% of fat. So if your ultrasound is saying there's no fat, there's a fair chance that there still may be fat. So, so you just need ultrasound because non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, as I said, is a whole spectrum. You have only fat, you have fat with inflammation, fat with fibrosis and cirrhosis, and hepatocellular carcinoma. That's the entire spectrum of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So you could, but for you to say, suppose you have a patient coming to you with fatty liver, with a cirrhosis. Now you, all the tests, hepatitis B, C, alcohol, everything is negative. Patient is a diabetic. You cannot say that he has NAFLD related cirrhosis without documenting at any point of time in the past that there was a documented fatty liver. Only if you have documented a fatty liver, you can say this was a fatty liver related cirrhosis. So that's what you need, a documentation of a fatty liver, and then whatever progression of the disease. Of course, if you want to definitely prove it, you need to do a biopsy. But if a patient comes to you when they already have a full-blown cirrhosis, even on biopsy, it will be a burnt out disease and you may actually not see any fat.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. There is one more question from Dr. Rajesh. Does hepatitis A infection give future protection from reinfection? And when should we vaccinate a patient post hepatitis A infection?
I don't think there are any guidelines for vaccination post-infection. I think once a patient has documented hepatitis A infection, in fact, majority, as I said, children don't have documented hepatitis A infection. It's a subclinical attack. They are exposed, and we get to know of it only when we do the antibody, anti-HAV IgG, which becomes positive, that we know that they've had a previous infection. So if you have had a normal naturally acquired antibody through an infection which was subclinical, you don't need to vaccinate, you're protected for life. Yes, so a hepatitis A infection definitely gives future protection.
So there's one more question from Dr. Prashant Mahajan. He is asking, is long-term use of statins associated with liver cirrhosis?
I'm glad Prashant has asked this question. This is actually a misconcept that because statins can raise your liver enzymes, they should not be given in patients with liver disease. In fact, most of your fatty liver disease patients may have dyslipidemia, and statins should be given. And it has been actually shown that if you give statins to patients with fatty liver disease, their enzymes actually improve because you're taking care of that component, which is hypertriglyceridemia or hypercholesterolemia, which is contributing to the fatty liver. So statins can definitely be given, and they do not cause cirrhosis. They can only cause sometimes raised enzymes, but they actually get better in a patient with fatty liver disease.
Dr. Vinod's question, can mefenamic acid be used for severe pain if not relieved by paracetamol in a case with cirrhosis?
Mefenamic acid is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. Again, I'm glad this question is asked because many people believe that mefenamic acid is a safer non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug to use, especially amongst the pediatric population. It is very, very popular. I would not say it is safe. I would say that if paracetamol is not helping, then you may switch to something like tramadol or opioids, but avoid non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs.
There's a question from Dr. Vinny Hutwani. She's asking, there's a patient with chronic liver disease with COVID-19. His percent saturation is 90%. His INR is 1.7 and D-dimer 5000, SGPT 70. Kindly advise on low molecular weight heparin and anticoagulation.
Yeah, very good question. This is actually crucial. INR, when we have a patient, and this is a concept which we have to kind of absorb, because we always associate liver disease with bleeding. We think there are no clotting factors produced in the liver, so the patient is more likely to bleed. But now we know that the liver not only produces clotting factors, which are deficient, it also produces anti-clotting factors, which are also deficient. So finally, whether the patient is going to bleed or actually have a higher risk of thrombosis depends on the balance of these clotting and anti-clotting factors. And we are now seeing patients of cirrhosis, rather than coming with bleeding, coming more and more with clotting and thrombosis. So INR is only measuring the clotting factors. It is not measuring the anti-clotting factors. So I would still give, so we have two situations here. We have a patient with chronic liver disease, which is now being considered actually as a prothrombotic state. And we have COVID, which is also a prothrombotic state. So these patients should be given anticoagulation, even if the INR is 1.7.
One more question. What antibody titer is needed for hepatitis B vaccination in adults who have not received proper vaccinations previously? Are statins at higher doses harmful too?
Yeah, so basically I mentioned this in my talk. You need an anti-HBs titer of more than 10 to be protected. And if somebody is immunocompromised, you need a titer of more than 100. This is the titer which is needed. Statin is a risk-benefit ratio. Normally, statins we will not give in somebody who's got decompensated cirrhosis. A patient of cirrhosis developed ascites, bleeds, encephalopathy, we will not give statins, but otherwise we'll give statins at whatever dose is required.
Has vitamin E any role in reversing fatty liver or cirrhosis? This is a question from Dr. Prashant Mahajan.
Vitamin E has been shown to be of some benefit. It may not reverse fibrosis, but it may reduce inflammation and steatosis. But I keep saying, we do give vitamin E. There are certain other drugs which have come into the market, but nothing can substitute lifestyle modification, diet, exercise, and weight reduction. That is the most important thing.
Question from Dr. Mitesh Bora. Is there any specific liver supplement for cirrhosis of liver, and any role of folic acid in fatty liver?
No. As I said, there's so many supplements in the market, both allopathic, non-allopathic, but really no supplement has been shown to inhibit the progress of liver disease. So no. And I mentioned the only supplement or tonic which I encourage is now black coffee.
And Dr. Vinny Hotwani is again asked, is there any change in anticoagulation doses in a patient with cirrhosis of liver?
No, I'll give the full dose which is needed. I would prefer low molecular weight rather than the direct acting oral anticoagulation in patients with liver disease. Because those cannot be easily reversed. So if I have to give, I would probably give them enoxaparin. That's what I would give. And the dose which is needed as per their body weight.
Question from Dr. Vikrant Pawar. What is the role of use of saroglitazar in fatty liver?
Yeah, this is a drug which is being heavily promoted nowadays for fatty liver. As I said, there are certain drugs. One is this and the other is obeticholic acid. Now, saroglitazar has been shown, again, only in Indian studies, we don't have anything from the West, to help steatosis and also the NASH, fibrosis and inflammation. It is specifically useful in those who have diabetes and dyslipidemia. So you may use it in that subpopulation.
And also the role of pioglitazone.
Pioglitazone is not a bad idea, especially if somebody diabetic and has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. You may give pioglitazone. The only downside of pioglitazone is that it causes weight gain. So it, in a way, defeats the purpose in a patient who has fatty liver disease. With pioglitazone. Otherwise, it's a good drug.
That brings us at the end of our session today. I think there are no more questions. There's one more question.
One more question, I think.
Yeah, one more question. What is for liver transplant in cirrhosis?
Yeah, so I mean that's a good question, but so there are many criteria which are there. But just to put it simply, if you have a patient of chronic liver disease who's developed a complication, who's developed ascites, which is not easily controlled, who has recurrent variceal bleeds, not easily controlled, who goes into encephalopathy, who develops spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, who develops hepatocellular carcinoma, which cannot be managed with local therapy or surgery. Then so any complication of chronic liver disease, one should start thinking about liver transplant. Especially if, I must add, the liver disease has no specific treatment. So if you have a patient with hepatitis B, hepatitis C, you have a specific treatment and you find that even if they have complications, they reverse. If you have a patient who drinks alcohol, he stops drinking alcohol at the right time, even with a decompensated cirrhosis, he can come back to a good baseline. But if you have somebody with a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, there is no specific treatment. And these are the patients who are going to develop higher risk of developing hepatocellular carcinomas, higher risk of developing vein thrombosis. And these are the patients who are now filling up the transplant list because there is no specific treatment for fatty liver disease.
Thank you, Dr. Abha. Very enlightening. I invite Dr. Amula to give a vote of thanks. Dr. Amula.
Yeah, Dr. Abha, that was a lovely and a fantastic, very informative lecture. I think you covered all points in such a fantastic way. I mean, so systematic and absolutely from non-COVID to COVID to alcohol to fatty, everything was covered in this short span of 1 hour. And I think we are very lucky to have you here for this lecture. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Nita. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Abha, for everything. It was a fantastic lecture. Chalo. Bye-bye.